welcome. If I could ask you to please turn off your phones, and if I could thank the sponsors for 2025 that the Shirim has sponsored for an aliyah for the neshamas of Brana Bas Brendit and Zelig Ben Kalman, Zichronim Livrocha. We're very grateful for that sponsorship. Okay. Baruch Hashem, you see in the streets the children walking around in their fancy dress. I hope you've all been enjoying that a little bit. And we are heading into Purim. I would like to talk today, it's quite a complicated topic. We're going to get into a lot of unusual and interesting Sforim. I'd like to talk today about tomorrow's very special calendar day, which is Taanit Esther. Now, as we know, there are 5 standard Ta'aniyot in the Jewish year. One of them is in the Torah, which is, of course, Yom Kippur, and 4 of them are from Zechariah. The fasts of Tzom Gedalia, of Asara B'Tevis, of Sheva Asar B'Tammuz, and the Tisha B'Av. But then we have 2 more standard fast days, which come from a much more complicated source. One of them is Taanit Esther, which we're going to talk about today. The other one is Taanit B'Chorot, the fast of the firstborn, which we're not going to talk about today. But they have more murky origins. And then there are other fasts that people take on, Bahab, which we are going to talk about today, where that maybe comes from, fasting on Monday, Thursday, Monday, certain times of the year. We'll see where that comes. But our main focus today is going to be on Taanit Esther, and I think we're going to uncover some new ground. So one of the things I strongly recommend is an article by Mitchell First. Mitchell First is a very interesting gentleman. I think he lives in Teaneck, somewhere like that. And he writes often on topics that he reviews and researches in an incredibly thorough way. He wrote an article called The Origin of Taanit Esther, which is an academic article, but is also summarized on Sforim blog, the Sforim blog, which is a blog about interesting Jewish issues. So you can Google that, and some of the information on today's sheet is from his own research. But let's start with something very straightforward about the other fasts. Number 1, in Zechariah. And there is a complicated debate as to where Zechariah and Esther fit together. They're around about the same time. According to the standard chronology in Jewish sources, then Zechariah comes after Esther. According to the academics, Zechariah comes just before Esther. But in either direction, it's important to learn them both together. And Rabbi Menachem Liebtag has some very good material online about how to learn Esther with Sefer Zechariah. And he reckons that you can't really learn the two independently because they cross-reference. But let's look in Zechariah now. These are the 4 fasts we just mentioned. We talked about this at length. As long as we fulfill the condition, we fix our problems between each other, we have an achdus in the Jewish people, which I want to come back to at the end. If we can fix that, then these 4 fasts will one day become days of feasting. Now, we will see that Taanit Esther, which does not appear here, may ironically be the one fast, apart from Yom Kippur, that survives into the times of Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, we may still very excitedly be fasting on Taanit Esther. Why would that be? But we'll see that as we come up. So let's have a look at the book of Esther itself. Now, it goes without saying that the fast of the 13th of Adar is not mentioned anywhere in the Megillah. Indeed, it is not mentioned anywhere in the Gemara. The first time we see any reference clearly for a fast on the 13th of Adar, which is tomorrow morning, is in the works of the Gaonim. We're going to get there in a few minutes, but we have a little ground to cover first. So let's first of all see what it does say in the Megillah about the 13th of Adar, and it says a lot. It just doesn't say the fasting. V'yikara'u sofrei hamelech, and the scribes of the kings read out b'chodesh harishon b'shloish asar yom bo, that on the first month of the year, that's Nisan, on the 13th of Nisan, the kasei k'chol asher tziva Haman, and everything that Haman was said was written down for that day. What was going to happen on that day, 13th Nisan? So runners came out with all of these, were sent out to all of the towns, lahashmid, laharog, ulabed, et kol haYehudim, that God forbid all the Jews should be killed, slaughtered, minar ad zakein, taf v'nashim, b'yom echad, on one day, the day of extermination of the Jews is going to be, b'shloisha asar l'chodesh shnei masar. It's going to be on the 13th of Adar. So on the 13th of Nisan, the year before, or the beginning of that year, if you like, we start from Nisan, they sent out that 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews would be killed, ushlalam mavois, and all their money would be stolen. Haratzim yatz'u dechufim, so the runners went out quickly to take out this message, b'dvar melech, to take out the king's message. The hadat nitna b'shushan abira. Everyone in Shushan, of course, right there, right now, knew about it immediately on that very day. The Hamelech v'Haman yashvu lishtat. This is the famous ending of the chapter 3 of the Megillah. The king and Haman sat down to drink, one of their drinking episodes to celebrate the annihilation of the Jews. The Ha'ir Shushan Navocha. And the Shushan was in shock. How could this be that there was a date set? And this date is the 13th of Adar. At this point is the date set for the annihilation of the Jews. So what happened? So a few things happened. There was an immediate and natural automatic response, which was fasting. Now this is not necessarily Taanit Esther as we know it, although if the 13th of Nisan was the day that it was given out, then this was happening in Nisan. Ubechal Medina Medina, number 3. Anywhere that they reach this terrible news, Evel Godel Yodim V'tzom Ubechi. There was instantaneous fasting, crying, sadness, mourning, umispeid sak va'efe yutzal rabim. And people put on sackcloth and ashes on the 13th, or round about the 13th of Nisan, which is when the original decree was made. Okay, fine. So we have one fast mentioned, or an instantaneous, spontaneous fasting mentioned. Number 4. Says Esther, when Mordechai is convinced that she has to intervene, Lech knoset kol haYehudim. So again, now gather all the Jews, and inside Shushan, because Shushan is where it's all happening. Presumably the other provinces had not yet received the news because it was on the way to them. V'tsumu alai. You have to now fast. This is not a spontaneous fast. This is an organized fast. Fast for me. V'al tochlu v'al tishtu shloishet yamin laila v'yom. Esther says to them 3 consecutive days, nights, days. Gam ani v'narotai atzum. Okay, we will also do this in the palace. So that's the second mention of fasting, but that's an organized fast by Nisan. By Esther? When did that happen? This fast in Nisan. Let's have a look at number 5. Says Esther Rabbah, the Midrash. V'toma Esther la'ashiv al Mordechai. So Esther says to answer to Mordechai. Amraloi, what did she say to him? Lech knoset kol haYehudim v'nim hanimsan v'shushan v'tzumo alai. V'al tochlu v'al tishlosh yamim. What are those 3 days? Elohem Yud Gimel, Yud Daled, v'Tet Vav b'Nisan. The 13th of Nisan, the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, and the 15th of Nisan, which is the day of Yom Tov. That was according to the Medrash Rabbah, the Esther Rabbah, they were the 3 days. The 13th, 14th, and 15th of Nisan. But that, of course, includes Yom Tov. And it, of course, overrides the mitzvah of eating matzah on Seder night, because she said, Laila v'yom, you can't just fast by day, you have to fast at night. And that is why the Gemara, quite famously, number 6, says, V'yavor Mordechai. Mordechai goes over, meaning pshat level, he goes over to institute what Esther told him, but V'yavor, as in Aveira, he instituted this transgression, as it were, but in a permitted way, Amarav, Shehevir Yom Rishon Shel Pesach B'Taanit. They spent the first day of Pesach, including, of course, all the mitzvahs of eating on that night of Pesach. Of course, they weren't eating Korban Pesach because A, they were in Shushan, B, there was no Beis HaMikdash, but they were eating matzah, they were eating, well, maror would have been D'Rabbanon, but I'm not getting in, maybe it wasn't even there yet, I'm not getting into that right now. But they were eating matzah for sure, but they weren't eating it because they were fasting. Okay? Esther, back into the Megillah, number 7. Esther. Rashi says, Aldat lehit anot. The ruling of Esther that they had to fast beyond Rishon Shel Pesach. Shehatani, because the fast was, says Rashi, interestingly, differently to the Medrash Rabbah. He says it was Yudalad Nisan, Tet Vav, and Tet Zayin. Interesting. Why Rashi differs from the Midrash Rabbah? The Midrash Rabbah said 13th, 14th, 15th. Rashi says it was 14th, 15th, 16th. I didn't look into that in great depth. According to Rashi, they were still fasting on Pesach, but they were also fasting on second day Yom Tov, okay? Which I'm sure people wouldn't mind if they'd been eating on first day Yom Tov, but since they were fasting on first day Yom Tov as well, they were, and who says there was even second day Yom Tov then? I'm not getting into all that now, but it was 14, 15, and 16th, Shehari Yom Yud Gimel Nichtevu Asfarim, because he says you can't count the 13th, because the 13th was the shock horror day on which they got the unbelievable bad news, and there had to be the response. And Esther, if you think about it, if the news went out on the 13th, how can the 13th be included in Esther's decree? Okay, this is terrible, fast for me. Because she would have had to respond, and it has to be Laila Yom, so she said starting tonight, 14, 15, 16. That makes perfect sense. I suppose the Midrash Rabbah might take into account the instantaneous, spontaneous fasting that they all had when they heard on the 13th, but then it's not 3 days anymore. You can think about that later. How can someone fast for 3 days? I don't suggest you try this. Laila Yom, Laila Yom, Laila Yom. There'll be nothing left at the end. So the Gemara, actually the Midrash Tehillim says, you really think that they fasted 3 consecutive days? There would have been no Jews left to kill. They would have all been dead. No. It meant that they, at the end of each day, they broke the fast. They had a little bit before sunset, just to, they fasted most of the day, and then they started again by night. So they ate every afternoon. Although, I must tell you that when the Gemara elsewhere talks in a completely different topic in Yevamot about a husband who's gone missing, and he turns out he's been in a pit with no food and water for 3 consecutive days, can we assume that he has died? Because who can live for 3 consecutive days without food and drink? The Gemara that actually brings this 3-day fast of Esther and assumes that they did fast for 3 consecutive days and somehow managed. Very unlikely, but very difficult. But therefore, he says, so you can't assume that 3 days is automatically impossible, but I'm leaving that aside for now. Okay, fine. That's all very well. What about the future? Where did the Taanit come in the future? So again, like I said to you, there's no reference to Taanit Esther on the 13th of Adar, but there is number 9. At the end, when everything has turned out well, Baruch Hashem, and Esther sends to have Purim in the future, she says the following. Mordechai and Esther send now. The Kayem et Yemei HaPurim HaEleh. That they have to fulfill, they have to keep these days of Purim, Bizmaneihem, on their days, because of course 14th and 15th, depending on where you are, etc. Ka'ashekim alei Mordechai Yehudi v'Esther HaMalka, just like Mordechai and Esther had instituted way back then. U'ka'asher, and just like Kimu al Nafsham v'al Zaram, just like they accepted upon themselves and upon their children, divrei hatzamot v'za'akatan, the days of fasts and crying out. Now, what does that mean? That's at the end of Purim. That's like they instituted for the future the days of Purim, just like they'd accepted on themselves and their children days of fasting and crying. Now, what does Zaram mean? Does Zaram mean their children, just like they fasted back then at the beginning, them and their children, and everybody fasted, so they're decreeing in the future everybody has to feast and celebrate, because that's what happened? Or is Zaram saying, no, there are 2 things being decreed here. There's a future festival, and there's a future fast day being decreed for them and their descendants. Zaram here doesn't mean the children who fasted then in Shushan, it means their descendants forevermore will have a fast, and we'll see soon that there are Meforshim that understand that Taanit Esther is in Megillat Esther, which is very interesting because ironically, that might make it even more important or in authority than the other fasts, which may be D'Rabbanan on some level, but this is right from Taanit Esther. We'll talk about that soon. And what's Divrei Tzomot? If there are future fasts, do we have to fast 3 days like Esther did? Or do we have to fast 1 day? We'll get to that soon. So the Ibn Ezra has some very interesting ideas here. The Ibn Ezra on Esther, look at number 10, says as follows. V'tam, what does it mean? V'kinu al nafshem v'al zaram divrei atzomot. Al data rabbim, so most people think this means, now, does that mean he thinks this means? Or he thinks most people think this means? Yom Taanit Esther. By the time of the Ibn Ezra in Italy, in Spain, in France, where he lived in the 12th century, people were all keeping Taanit Esther. We know that. It was established by then. He says, okay, that's Taanit Esther. But there are those who say, no, it's not time. There was no such thing as Taanit Esther. It's al shloshi yamin shetanu shehitanu b'Nisan akasav medaber. No, this is meant to be a fast of 3 days in Nisan. Okay? And maybe everybody should fast 3 days in Nisan from now on onwards. Like Esther's saying, just like we fasted in Nisan, you'll also fast in Nisan. So you're going to say to me, but how can we fast on Pesach? Okay, so find a different day in Nisan. Maybe you don't have to do it after on Pesach, but there are 3 days you have to find to fast. Maybe it means that. But Kol Yisrael well, if he da'ati, and I don't agree with that. What do I think, says the Ibn Ezra? They fixed fasts for the days of terror. Which are the days of terror? And why is it plural? Esther is referring to Zechariah, Shehein B'Tammuz, V'Av, V'Tishrei, V'Tevet. And he says, therefore, even though you didn't realize it, this book, in this reference in Esther, is referencing the 4 fasts of Sab Gedalia, Shabbat B'Tammuz, etc., which are referred to in Zechariah. Very nice. V'atam, ki kimu ayudim al nasham, lismok b'yemei Purim, and because they accepted fasts in the future, okay, just like they accepted the feast in the future, okay, these fasts for the future would be the 4 fasts. Now, these that we fast today, these deniers, the machchishim, who says you have to fast 3 days, it's nothing to do with the other fasts. Who does he call the machchishim? Those who are the deniers of Judaism. He's referring to the Karaites. And we'll see soon the Karaites, and maybe this even went on after the Karaites, I mean there are still Karaites, insisted that you have to fast 3 days. You can't, they didn't accept Taanit Esther, it has to be 3 days, and we'll get to them soon. Okay, fine. So far, so good. What have we had so far? 13th of Adar features very strongly in Megillas Esther as the day that was earmarked for annihilation. It didn't turn out that way, and therefore now maybe there's some kind of fast in the future. Maybe it's Taanit Esther, maybe it's the 4 fasts that we have, which are nothing to do with Megillas Esther. Maybe, according to the Karaites, it's 3 fasts. We'll see soon. Now, little known to most people is that actually in the Second Temple period, the 13th of Adar was a separate feast day. Nothing to do with Purim. The 13th had its own Yom Tov, which is what? Says number 11. The Gemara in Taanit refers to a book rather confusingly called Megillat Taanit. Megillat Taanit is a Second Temple book listing all the special holidays, largely connected with the Hashmonaim, who won different battles against the Greeks, where we celebrate these great victories of the Jews and we don't fast. That's why it's called Megillat Taanit. It's like a kind of Lashon Sagi Nahor. It's the scroll of fasts, which are the days that we don't fast. Yeah, like Kiddusha Rabbah on Shabbos morning, the great Kiddush is the one which is the small one. Okay, we're not getting into why there's such a thing as Lashon Sagi Nahor. Okay, so one of those fasts, I mean, the famous ones are Purim and Chanukah. They're the ones that survived. And another one that didn't survive, because most of them didn't survive, was Betleisar on the 13th of Adar. Yom Nikanor is the day of Nikanor. So who's Nikanor? My Nikanor. Not to be confused with the Nikanor gates in the temple, which were donated by a Jew called Nikanor. This is a non-Jew. It must have been a popular name at the time. Okay, Nikanor was a non-Jew. Who was he? Titania. Nikanor echad me afarche Yevanim haya. He was one of the Greek generals at the time of the Antiochus. Every day he would stand up and wave his hands al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim towards Yehuda and Yerushalayim, not just Yerushalayim but Yehuda, where the Hashmonaim were living. But Omer, and he would say, "Ei matai tipol b'yadai va'aram sena." When am I going to capture Jerusalem and Yehuda and lay it waste? I'm looking over the border, waiting for the day that I'm going to invade and I'm going to kill all the Jews. Okay. Ushigavra Malchus Beis Chashmonai v'Nitzchum, and when later the Chashmonaim beat Antiochus and his people, Katsatsu b'hoines yada v'raglav. They cut off his toes and fingers and thumbs. Yeah, v'ta'alum b'shari Yerushalayim, and they hung them from the gates of Yerushalayim. Okay? I don't know whether it was like shtick. No, it wasn't shtick. He was very serious. But they hung them up. I wonder whether it was related to Adoni Bezek, who in Yeshua, where they in Shoftim rather, where they cut his fingers and toes off. It was Yeshua. Okay, but I don't know about that. The Amrun, they said, Pa Shahaya Madaber Begaiva. Okay, here where he would speak so arrogantly, the Yadayim Shahainu Menifas al Yerushalayim, and these hands that waved across to Yerushalayim, Tase Bahem Nekama. This is where he ends up, fingers and toes up on the walls. And it's this kind of the hanging of the Bnei Haman who wanted to kill the Jews, are the people who end up, not killing the Jews, etc. Now it's interesting because if you look at this, if you look at other records of this is not the only place that this man is mentioned. He comes up in Josephus about this battle. It's called the Battle of Adassa. Adassa is from the Hebrew word Chadasha. It's near Beit Horon, which were a lot of the battles over there. And it comes up also in the Sifrei HaMakkabim, Sefer Makkabim Aleph and Sefer Makkabim Bet, this battle. And it's interesting that there was a Persian punishment at the time that they cut off the head and the fingers of the general. Okay, it's interesting, which would actually fit better because this would be the mouth that spoke and the hands that waved. But by the time of the Gemara, it turns into the fingers and toes. I'm not getting into all of that now. But what's interesting about the Battle of Hadasha is that it's seen as one of the most famous victories of Yehuda HaMaccabi, especially since the Greeks at this battle broke the treaty that they'd agreed with the early Romans not to use weapons of mass destruction on the battlefield. What were weapons of mass destruction in the ancient world? War elephants. War elephants. Now, the Romans did not have elephants because, in case you didn't realize, if you've ever been to Italy and you go around the sightseeing, you ain't going to see any elephants. If you want elephants, you've got to go. Oh, yeah, that's why. And they're all hiding in the fridge, right? But you won't see any elephants because if you want elephants, where do you got to go? You've got to go to India, which, of course, the Greeks had access to India. The Romans didn't. Or you've got to go to Africa. And, of course, the famous story of Hannibal, which, of course, who was Phoenician, Hannibal, okay, who went with his elephants across and over the Alps, etc., etc. So the Romans were scared stiff of war elephants because this is a weapon of mass destruction. You can't beat these things. And they made the Greeks sign that they would never use them in 181 BCE. This 180 something BCE. This battle was in 161 BCE, and the Greeks broke the treaty. And Yehuda HaMaccabi had to contend not just with the Greeks, but with these war elephants. And that's the famous victory. And they killed the elephants. And later there's the story of Elazar, where the elephant fell on top of him. And that's why the Yeshuv Elazar is in Elazar in Gush Etzion, because that's one of the ways that he just killed the elephant with a sword, and it fell on him. It's named after him. So this was actually a very, very famous battle indeed. Although Yehuda HaMaccabi himself was killed a year later. Now, why are we interested in this? Because Megillat Taanit is a list of days on which you're not allowed to fast, and you're not allowed to give eulogies. And one of those days is the 13th of Adar. So how could the 13th of Adar have been a fast, Taanit Esther, or whatever, when it was dafka the opposite? It was a day on which you were not allowed to fast. Okay, we'll see how that happens. Also, you have another, perhaps less pressing problem, but a problem is Megillat Taanit also says you're not allowed to fast on the day before any of the days mentioned in Megillat Taanit. So even if you want to say, Nicanor, Shmicanor, I'm not worrying about Nicanor, but Purim itself, the 14th, was in Megillat Taanit, should have had its own din, if you like, that you couldn't fast the day before. So either way, we have a bit of a problem with Taanit Esther, and we're going to have to see how we get through that. Okay, let's go. Page number 3. There is a good source, by the way, for something that the Karaites said. When the Karaites said there should be a 3-day Yom Tov, actually their source is not just in their own literature, but there's a rabbinic source. I don't know if they knew there was a rabbinic source. If they had known, I'm sure they would have denied it. But let's look at number 12. Minhag Rabotenu. There is a minhag. Masechet Sofrim. Masechet Sofrim is a later Masechet. It's in the 9th, 10th century. There's a scholarly debate exactly where it was composed, maybe in Eretz Israel, maybe around in Byzantium or in Italy. It's a slightly later Masechet than the Gemaras, but it says as follows: Minhag Rabosenu Shebema'arav. The rabbis in Israel had a minhag, meaning not the Babylonians, the rabbis in Israel. Lehitanot shloisha yemei tzoim Mordechai ve'Esther prudot. They would fast a 3-day fast of Mordechai and Esther, but not one day after the other. Prudot. They would pick 3 days. Fast, then another fast, but not together. Ula acha Purim, and they do it after Purim. Okay? There's a zeicher. Now, when was the original 3-day fast? In Nisan, not before Purim. So, okay, they did it after Purim. Sheni v'chamishi v'sheni. Bahab. They fast Bahab, but not Bahab that we fast, or some people fast after Pesach, but this was Bahab after Purim. So why not do it in Nisan when you were meant to do it in Nisan? Okay, don't do it on Yom Tov, but do it in Nisan. So you can't. Why is Nisan so special? Because that's the month in which the Mishkan was established. And the first 12 days of Nisan were dedicated to the erection of the Mishkan, and each Nasi brought a korban. Yom lekol shevet v'shevet, v'kol echad haya oiseh b'yom Yom Tov. Every single day of Nisan is a Yom Tov. It might not feel that way when you're cleaning for Pesach, but just remember, as you're scrubbing whatever you're scrubbing, today is a Yom Tov because this is a day that the Mishkan was established and there was this different Nasi that brought a korban. And so too in the future, okay, Atid HaMikdash lehibanot b'Nisan. The temple is going to be built in Nisan, l'kayem mashenema, as it says, to establish ein kol chadash tachash Hashemet. Very interesting. Nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. We will have our Mishkan, we will have our temple, please God, in Nisan. Now, what does this mean? It means that they couldn't fast in Nisan, so they pushed it to the end of Adar. So they fasted 3 different days at the end of Adar. And I brought you in the footnotes another reference that talks about this fast at the end of Adar. And maybe this was only in Israel, this was not in Bavel. There's a whole discussion about that. There is a book called the Sefer Minhag Tov. It's certainly not known much to me. It's an Italian book from the 13th century. It says there were some people that fasted before Purim in Adar, 3 days, either consecutively if they could, or broken up. There was a custom amongst some Marano women who were from Spain, from the expulsion from Spain, or in Spain, when living as Christians, that they fasted for 3 days a month before Pesach. And there were even Karaites that said you have to fast 70 different days. Now you know why the Karaites died out, okay? Because they said from between the 13th of Nisan and the 23rd of Sivan, you should do a lot of fasting. The truth is that I don't think people ate such a lot those days, anyway. I'm not sure that there was a massive difference between the day that you did eat and the day that you didn't eat back in the day. Today, we've become a little bit more, mufunakim on this issue. Okay, Beseder Gamor. So we have this evidence of a 3-day fast. We'll come back to it soon. But where does Taanit Esther come from? Okay, so we saw already that the 13th was the day on which the Jews were meant to be annihilated, but what in fact happened on the 13th of Adar, number 13, this is very important. Because in the end, the king gave the Jews permission, look at this word, lehikahel, to all be together, to gather together. They actually, they were able to defend themselves on the 13th. They were able to take the money, although in the end they didn't take any money, okay, which is interesting. But there was one day set aside in the whole Persian Empire, which was what? The 13th of Adar for us is Yom Kehillah. It's community day. It's the day that we came together, the day that we pulled ourselves together, the day that we managed to fight back against all powers of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, anti-Torah that we had to defend on that day, and that is what happened. Look in number 14. In the 12th month, says the Megillah, the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the month, all the places where the king's word had come, very interesting word, sibru, that they'd announced, they planned in advance that the enemies, lishlot bahem, to kill the Jews, v'nafochu, and it was all turned upside down. Asher Yishtu Yudim, and in the end, the Jews were the ones that were able to fight back. They came against their enemies. Nikhalu, again, this word kahal, Nikhalu Ayudim, Ba'arehem, everyone got together. To get back, to prevent their massacre. The Ishlo Amad Lifnehem, and nobody would stop them. Okay? Yom Shlosh Adar is the Yom Kihila, and this I will see is very important. This is the real foundation, hashkafically, of Taanit Esther. It's Yom Kihila. It's the day of Kihila. By the way, another day of Kihila, way back in the history of the Jewish people, was Har Sinai. Okay, that's also called the Yom Kihila, and that actually is part of the connection between the acceptance of the Torah at Purim, the acceptance of the Torah at Sinai. There's a link there which we're not going to get into now. And in fact, in 3 places, it talks about the fact that the Jews gathered together. I brought you number 15. The Jews outside Shushan, Nikhalu, they also gathered together. To defend themselves. And there were 75,000 that they killed to defend themselves. But they didn't take any of the booty. That's one of the Purim Torahs. How do you know that the Jews never used credit cards back in the day? Because it says Ubavisa lo shalchu et yadam. Fine. V'yom shlosha asar l'chodesh Adar, on the 13th of Adar, again the 13th, v'noch bar saboy, and they rested on the 14th for Asa Oisa Yom Mishtav. Fine. The Gemara, in fact, when it talks about the 13th, remember the Gemara, and we're going to come back to that Gemara in a minute. The Gemara at the beginning, the Mishnah at the beginning of Megillah, says that when do you read the Megillah? Well, most people read on the 14th, and the Jews in Wall City read on the 15th, and the Kfarim, the villages, they have special permission lahakdim to bring it forward liyom haknisa. Remember that word liyom haknisa. So the Gemara goes through which days will that be, and it says, well, we can't be talking about the 13th. We can only be talking about the 11th and the 12th, because the 13th, you know, before this Gemara, the 13th is famous, says the Gemara. You don't need the rabbis to give special dispensation to extend Purim to the 13th. Why not? Number 16. Kedama Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Shloishasa Zman Kihila Lekolhi. Because the 13th is already famous. You don't need a rabbinic decree because it's Zman Kihila. So you see the rabbis in the Gemara recognize the day of the 13th of Adar as Zman Kihila Lekol. It's a day where everyone has to get together. Okay, fine. How did we end up fasting on this day? So I'm going to do this quite quickly. There are 5 or 6 places in the Gaonim, not in the Gemara, in the Gaonim that start explicitly mentioning the idea of Taanit Esther. The first one is the She'iltis. The She'iltis of Rabbi Chai Gaon, an early Gaonic work. It says the following: Aval Taanit ben Krachim ben Kfarim ben Yaros. It's irrespective of when they read the Megillah. When it comes to the fast, Kulam mit'anim b'shlosh asar ba'adar. Everybody fasts on the 13th of Adar. There you have it. That's Taanit Esther explicitly. By the time of the Gaon in the 8th, 9th century, they were already talking about Taanit Esther the way we know it today. And that's what they understand to be Zman Kihila. At the end of that line it says, my Kihila. What does it mean to get together? Why would the Jews get together? Yom Taanit. We get together for an asifa. We get together for a fast. We get together to do tshuva. We do achdus, etc. So it says that's why it's called the Yom Kihila. That obviously is a fast day, and therefore that is an early source for that. Similarly, in the Midrash Tanchuma, there is a little tshuva embedded into the Midrash Tanchuma. I'm not going to read the whole thing in number 18, but it rereads the Mishnah. Remember the Mishnah at the beginning of Megillah that I just mentioned, when it says that the Kfarim, the villages, could bring it back to the Yom HaKnisa. Now, the normal way we understand the Yom HaKnisa is it's market day. Market day, what was the problem in the villages? They didn't have anyone who could read the Megillah, or they didn't have a minyan, but you don't really need a minyan for Megillah, but they didn't have anyone who could read. So on Mondays and Thursdays, either the villagers went to the towns to buy produce, so they were in a big place and they could read, or the townspeople went to the villages, different Meforshim, to sell to the villagers on market day. Either way, they got a minyan. So Yom HaKnisa, according to most Meforshim, says that's when they read the Megillah. Says this tshuva, no. Look at the sort of about 6 lines up from the bottom where it says Liyoshe Batanis. Okay, it says at the end, my Yom HaKnisa. What does it mean in the Mishnah, the Yom HaKnisa? Yom HaKahal. It's the day of Kahal. Now, you and I know what that day means, the day of Kahal. That's the day we all get together to fast. To fast. The Gazru Taanit b'shlosh asar ba'adar. And they instituted a fast on the 13th. What's the deal with the Kfarim? According to this, not that they read Megillah early. They had special permission to fast early. Okay, but the fast is on the 13th. She'im chal, so he says now, She'im chal yodalid liyos be'echad b'Shabbos. This is a beautiful source, by the way, at the end. Because if the 14th Purim day falls on a Sunday, so the 13th is Shabbos, okay? So you can't fast on Shabbos. But by the way, the 14th can easily fall on a Sunday. It happens all the time, okay? Also, Taanit b'Shabbos, you can't fast on Shabbos. So when do you fast? Ube Erev Shabbos, so why not fast on Friday? You fast on a Friday. It's actually a good idea that many people bring down that you should fast on a Friday because, be hungry for Shabbos. But a communal fast, it's one thing having a public fast, saying, look, I'm going to skip lunch because I want to be hungry for Shabbos. But it says, Erev Shabbos, Nami also mipnei TORAH Shabbos. You can't have a public fast on a Friday because people have to make Shabbos. Okay? And we'll see what that means in a minute. But you bring it forward to Thursday, Shehu Achad Asar Ba'adar, which is the 11th of Adar. And that's what the Mishnah is talking about. Because the main point of a communal fast is slichas, is rachamim, the asili nuimi covered Shabbos, and that will stop you from covered Shabbos. What does covered Shabbos mean? Getting ready properly for Shabbos. Getting dressed, getting showered, making the food, cleaning the house. How can you do that if you're in this public, Yom Kihila? He says there, covered Shabbos adif mi 1,000 tanios. And covered Shabbos is more important than 1,000 fast days. This should be a mussar. I take this for myself because I'm the one that always is like leaving things to the last minute on Shabbos. And I'm running around 10 minutes before Shabbos on with my checklist. Like, what did I do this, did I do that? He says, no, that's not the right way to be. Getting ready properly for Shabbos is worth 1,000 fasts. Rav Soloveitchik had a great line in America. He said, many Jews in America keep Shabbos, and very few of them keep Erev Shabbos. Friday is a proper... The covered Shabbos Doraita. That's interesting. Covered Shabbos we normally learn from Yeshayahu. No, it's Doraita on a certain level. The Tanis D'Rabbanan. The Asi covered Shabbos Doraisa V'dachi Tanis D'Rabbanan. This source is actually a beautiful source for covered Shabbos, apart from the Tanis, but it does tell us that the Tanis was on the 13th, and maybe some people had special permission to bring it earlier. It also, we're going to have to deal with the question of whenever we have a fast day and it falls on Shabbos, we never bring it earlier. We always push it off. Why do we push it off? Why do we bring Puranas forward? We never bring fasting and mourning forward. Sarah Teves can fall on a Friday, but it can never fall on a Shabbos, which is interesting. And we would maybe even Ezra talks about that, but because we push off a tragedy, maybe Mashiach will come, whatever that means in the short term, whatever. Tanis Esther we bring forward. Why? That tells you something already about the day, that it's actually not the same kind of day. We'll see. It's a Yom Kihila. It's not a day of mourning. It's a day of tshuva. And it's quite different. Now, days of mourning are also days of tshuva, but this is a very different kind of day. So let's have a look in the Rishonim. Let's go on. We're steaming ahead into the Rishonim. I've skipped over some Gaonim. I mentioned in the top of page 5, there's a tshuva of Natronaigon, Rav Natronaigon, that talks about this as well. He talks about Taanit Purim. He calls it Taanit Purim. According to one Girsa, he calls them Taaniyot Purim. Which then, once he says Taaniyot Purim, everyone's, the 3 day, remember the 3, okay, Karaites. So apparently it's really meant to be Taanit Purim. There's also a tshuva of Rav Sharira and Rav Haigon, a father-son team, where they talk about Sheva brachas that falls on the 13th of Adar, and who and whether you can drink the kosher bracha. So the fact that they're talking about whether you can drink the kosher bracha on the 13th of Adar, clearly they had a fast day that day, and we see that. I mean, you could have Sheva brachas easily. I went to a wedding 2 nights ago. So I suppose they're going to be having Sheva brachas on the 13th of Adar, which is one of the things that now you know where to look. Okay, into the Rishonim. So the Abu Dharam says, like we were just saying before, that this is not the same as other fasts. Number 19. Od mit'ani b'yud gimel ba'adar. He's listing the fast. We also fast on the 13th of Adar, hasamoch leNisan, the Adar that comes just before Nisan, if it's a leap year. The Einu mefurish b'kasav. This is not in the Psukim. The Loy b'Talmud. This is not in the Gemara. Ela chachamim achronim tiknuhu. Later chachamim brought it on. Who? The Gaonim. It comes from the Gaonim. Acha chasimus haTalmud, and it happened after the Talmud was sealed. So it's a Gaonic fast, which already makes it quite different to the other fasts, which are from Zechariah, which are from the Gemara. This is a Gaonic fast. The Rambam also makes that distinction. Number 20. He says, Arba Yemei HaTzomas HaElu, the 4 fasts that we get from Zechariah, Hariheim Mefurashim B'Kabbalah. They are explicit in the Tanakh. The Kabbalah, he means the received Tanakh. And he quotes from Zechariah. And then he says in Halacha Hey, number 20, V'nahagu kol Yisrael b'zmanim eileh, and the minhag these days is lehitanus b'shloisha asar ba'adar. The minhag is to fast on the 13th. Zeicher l'tanit shehitanu b'yimei Haman is a remembrance of the fast in Haman's time. Shneimar direi hatzomot v'za'akatam. So the Rambam in Spain and then North Africa says, yeah, we have a minhag to fast on the 13th. He doesn't say it was instituted by the Gaonim specifically. He sounds like it's a minhag of the people. Maybe there's a difference there. He was less bothered, by the way, by what was instituted by the Gaonim, because as far as he was concerned, if you're not in the Gemara, you don't have any greater status than anyone living today. He felt himself on the same level as the Gaonim. Before him, it's explicit. But he said, look, it's a minhag. You can't break a minhag. A minhag is a minhag. The Rosh in Ashkenaz says, yes, people keep this minhag. And they keep it for a very interesting reason. Number 21. Perish Rabbeinu Tam. Here we have Ashkenazim. It's an interesting agreement between the Sfarim and the Ashkenazim. Zman kehila l'kol. What is this Zman kehila? She'akol mitasfim Taanit Esther. Everyone gathers together for Taanit Esther. Ubaim b'nei akfarim, and the people from the villages come liyaros to the towns. Why do they come to the towns? Loima slichos. They come to say slichos. Tachanunim. Lefi sheboy nikhalu la'amod al nasham v'hayu tzrichim rachamim. And he brings a separate reason. He says, no. It's not because of Esther. It's because the 13th of Adar is the day that we came together to defend ourselves as Jews. And therefore, that's the day that we needed Rachamim, and we got it. Therefore, this is the greatest day of the year for the Jews to get together to say Slichos. Because of all times, of all history, this is the most successful day, if you like, that we were given Vanafachu, because I'm sure at the beginning of the battle, they didn't know how it was going to go. Maybe they thought that thousands of Jews would die and they would lose. It wasn't clear. Yeah?
This makes this even less clear to me. If this was something that saved us,
Yes.
why do we celebrate it by and so on?
Good. Coming up in a Rav Soloveitchik in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. We'll get there. That's a great question. That's a perfect question. We're going to get there in a couple of minutes. Okay? Just for now in bold, in the middle of number 21. And this didn't start with Purim. We see with Moshe, she'asa tanis k'shenilcham ba'amalek. There's a tradition that Moshe also fasted when they fought against Amalek, and we see later in Tanakh that Shaul instituted a fast when they fought against the Plishtim, etc., etc. This is a support for what we now call Taanit Esther, etc. Okay, so there you see the Ashkenazim and the Sfardim are all fasting on Taanit Esther, but it's not a regular fast. Number 22, the Ritva, Spain. 14th century, 13th century, late 13th century. ומכאן יש סמך למה שנהגו העולם לטענס ביום י' ג' שלא נצינו לו זכר אחר תלמוד בשום, זכר אחר בתלמוד בשום מקום. We don't see any hint to this 13th of Nisan in the Gemara, but everyone agrees this is a fast day, he says. מכל מקום לא מצינו תענית זה בכלל הצום שהם גזרו חכם, but גזירת חכם. You can't count this as the same as one. Don't make the mistake of thinking this is like Asara Batavis. Ela ke'inyan Taanit yachid, ke'ein Taanit yachidu. It's like a private fast. But of course you have to fast. Mishum al titosh Torah simecha. It's not because of Tanakh. It's because of the idea of you have to not abandon minhag. Minhag is very important. I mean, that's also in Tanakh, but the idea is from minhag. But he thinks you have to accept Taanit Esther the day before because it's more like a private fast. We don't pass him that way. You don't have to accept Taanit Esther this afternoon like you would a completely private fast. And since he doesn't really have a rabbinic basis in the Gemara. When it falls on a Sunday, L'Tanis b'Yom Ha'Hei, we go bring it back to Friday. Shelafana v'Afa Pishu Yom Yud Aleph, even though it's the 11th. V'Loi Ha'Yom Yom Kihila, and it's not the real day. It's okay because it's like a private fast. We don't have a problem of bringing forward Puranut, because it's nothing to do with Puranut. It's nothing to do with terrible things that happened. On the contrary, it's to do with wonderful things that happened. So you asked the question, well, if it's to do with wonderful things that happened, let's have a glass of wine. So the answer is that's the next day. Okay, and we'll see why. We also have a glass of wine, but we have to fast first. We'll see Rav Soloveitchik on that in a minute. Rashi has an interesting tshuva in his siddur. I'm not going to say it inside, I'll mention it outside. A woman asked him a shaila, a very pious woman. She said she's got a big journey to do on Taanit Esther, and she's got to ride on a horse all the way through the day, and it's very difficult, and she doesn't want to fast. And can she get a heter to not fast on Taanit Esther, but she'll fast the next day on Friday to kind of make up for it, yeah? I don't think today people would put that as part of their shaila, I'll fast the next day. And he says to her, no, I'm sorry. Riding a horse is a pain, but it's not like, you're not sick and you'll manage. And he doesn't say, oh, you're a woman, you're weak, you're riding a horse. He says, no, you have to fast. Everyone fasts, you have to fast. It's like a different kind of fast, but it's a minhag. You can't mess with a minhag. A minhag is a minhag. It's nothing to be taken lightly. And he says, no, you have to fast, even though it's what he calls a minhaga ba'alma. So we see pretty universal acceptance that this is done at the same time on the 13th of Adar in Sephardi and Ashkenazi lands. Few new things. Okay, the Ravid. The Ravid wants to say that it comes from the Megillah itself. He says an interesting thing. Look at number 25. Quoted here by the Ram. The Ravid's living in southern France. What I like about this is that we're covering almost every single community. The Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, the Provençal. We haven't had any Yemenites. Sorry. But okay, we get the Ravid now. The Ravid in southern France. Because of the Yud Gimel ain't a dominant Shatanis. Yud Gimel is not like the other fasts. The Zikaron hu lenes. It's not a Zikaron of the Churban, it's a Zikaron of the Nes. Shenasuba. V'oid sheyesh lan esmach b'kasav. And he thinks it's indicated in the Psukim where it says, Ka'ashe kimu al nasham divrei atzomot. It's mentioned there in chapter 9 of the Megillah. Lomar, saying, Kashem shekiblu aleihim la'asot Yontzef, just like they celebrated Yontzef, Kach kiblu aleihim divrei atzomot. Purim is a package deal. It's a day of drinking, and it's a day of fasting. It's part of the deal. And he says, and then he addresses the issue. And if you want to ask me, in Kem Shiyud Gimel Taanit Kavua Hu, Heichmanu Yom Nikanor B'chlal Yamim Tovim. He says, if it was in the Megillah that this was such a special fast day, and they were fasting during the Second Temple period, if it really comes from the Megillah, how could they have this feast, Yom Nikanor? And he gives a difficult answer. No, it's that you could only. The only problem is that you would not be allowed to give a hesped. But really there was never a problem of fasting on these special days. It was only a problem of being sad. But actually this was not a sad day. This was a happy day. This was a happy fast day. That's a little bit difficult. What's he saying? He's saying that all these days in Megillat Taanit, really the problem with them, these feast days, is that you weren't allowed to give a hesped because you weren't allowed to be sad. But you were allowed to fast. But why is it called Megillat Taanit? The name Megillat Taanit sounds like it's something to do with fasting, and the Ran doesn't like that answer. He rejects it and he says, this doesn't make any sense. I don't think this is the case. You can't really give that answer. You could give an answer, which we're going to see in a minute. It's a happy fast, and the only problem of the special Megillat Taanit was a sad fast. The problem is fasting because you're sad, as opposed to fasting because you're happy. We'll see that coming up in a minute. Let's just skip the Ozarua for a second and go to the Shulchan Aruch. Bottom line, page 7, 27. Okay? And then we'll get into Hashkafa, which I think is fascinating. Page 7, source 27. Says, what's the bottom line? Shulchan Aruch. Mitani b'Yud Gimel ba'Adar. You have to fast tomorrow, 13th of Adar. V'im chal Purim be'echad b'Shabbos. And if Purim falls on Sunday, not like this year, but if it falls on Sunday, you bring it back to the Thursday before. Says the Ramah, but this is not like an obligatory fast. It's a minhag-based fast. It's not a purely halachic fast. And therefore, we are actually, bottom line, even though it's hashkafically very important, we are more lenient on the fast of Esther than other fasts. Okay? Kagain, mu'ubarot, pregnant women, or menikot, or nursing women, or l'chale she'ein bo sakana, or a regular chale. Now, our minhag today is the pregnant women and nursing women don't fast on any of the fasts other than maybe Tisha B'Av and certainly Yom Kippur, obviously. But he says, even if you are someone who rules that the pregnant women should fast on Asara B'Tevis or whatever, not on Taanit Esther. Even someone who has a real migraine, a Kovei 9 is a migraine. Someone who has a migraine, I mean, not just like they have a slight headache, they have a migraine. And it really is upsetting them. They don't have to fast. It says, but they have to make up the fast on Friday. Yeah, don't think you're getting out of it. If you eat on Taanit Esther because you think you have to fast another day, because the point is that Purim has to have a fast. He's saying Purim has to have a fast. You still want an answer? I'm going to tell you in a minute. Aval sharbrim, but regular healthy people, just with maybe a slight michush, a headache, a tummy ache. No, you shouldn't break from the tzibur. It's a fast day. The imchal Purim b'yom aleph shemit'anim boy hey and if the fast is even brought forward to the Thursday, v'chal bo bris milah, and you have a bris milah. I don't know if any of you are going to a bris tomorrow. If you're going to a bris tomorrow, then there's a whole debate: who can eat? Can the people eat? Can the balei bris eat? Can the father and the mother eat? I'm not getting into that now. That's an interesting halacha. So, bottom line, halachically, Taanit Esther is a binding fast, but it's a fast based on minhag. You shouldn't separate from the community, even more so on this day. This is the last day of the year that you want to separate from the community, because the 13th of Adar is Community Day. That is Yom Kihila, which is, I think, why they're so focused on this. Because the whole point of this day is tzibur. It's about Klal Yisrael coming together. Okay, now, let's look at the hashkafa. In the last 7 minutes or so of this year, let's look at the hashkafa. And I'm not going to read all of these inside, but I want to mention a few of them. So, the Orchos Chaim, which is connected with the Kolboi, the Orchos Chaim says there that normally you wouldn't be allowed to fast on the day before a feast day. Megillat Taanit feast days, he's not bothered by Yom Nikanor, he's bothered by the fact that Purim is one of the two that survived Megillat Taanit. Megillat Taanit was abolished, all these special feast days was abolished when the Churban happened. Like, well, what are we celebrating Yom Nikanor? We are out of our minds. It's a Churban. But the two that survived were Megillah and were Purim and Chanukah. So he says, I'll tell you why it's not a problem to fast the day before Purim. That's Purim, it's Megillas Taanit, so you're not allowed to fast the day before. He says, because Taanit Esther, he says, is a happy fast. It's not a sad fast. It's a day that you fast, but you have your music on, and you can dance around the house, and you can get dressed up in costume, and you can go and, that it's nothing to do with Churban. He said, and therefore, there was never a suggestion that should be a problem before Purim. On the contrary, it's part of Purim. And now I'll answer your question as to why it is. Look with me at the Eshkol, the Sefer Eshkol. Very, very interesting Sefer, 12th century Provence, says the Sefer Eshkol as follows. Garsinam b'Rosh Hashanah, b'Perik Kama, v'Hilchasa b'Tela, v'Megillas Tanis, v'Hilchasa loy b'Tela. We have this apparently contradictory phrase in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah. We got rid of Megillas Tanis. We didn't get rid of Megillas Tanis. Which is it? The Lo Kasha. Not a problem. How about Chanukah Purim? Because Chanukah Purim, we did not get rid of these feast days. B'Shara Yomi, and the Gemara says, but the others, we did. The Ikar de Kasha, and I have a problem, he says, the Kasha, Kiv the Chanukah Purim Lo Batli. Since Chanukah and Purim are still there, Lifnei Mulachreim Nami Lo Batli. So we should also have a prohibition of fasting the day before, like I said. Why did the rabbis make, he seems to think it's like a rabbinic decree we saw before, Taanit Esther. The Lo Yadinam not Takine. So we don't even know who decreed Taanit Esther, Taanit Barbara. We don't have no clarity on that, but everyone does it. Really, it should be also the day before a feast to fast. And look what he says. They had this day of great suffering, tragedy. We have to fight our enemies. We may die today. Today's the day we may die as Jews. Existential threat. They had to go to war. We had to send our people in to fight. They had this day of terrible stress, anxiety. And then relief on the 14th when they celebrated. And he says, you can't have Purim without experiencing both. You can't have that celebration without first feeling the anxiety. You can only really be happy on the 14th if you felt the suffering and anxiety on the 13th. Not because it's sad. It's not sad. But it's the only way you can really feel the simcha is to experience the anxiety that goes before the simcha. I think we can relate to this a little bit. You know, I'm not sure that what's happening at the moment is finished yet. I think it's not finished yet. But the idea of anxiety and facing threat and then going from that into simcha, where our enemies are beaten and destroyed, and how could that happen? And we were so worried, but now we're so relieved. But then now we think of it more, and we're now worried again. This combination, he says, that's part of what Purim is. Purim is not a day of just feasting. Purim is a day of experiencing both those emotions. You might ask or add, why do we eat maror at the Seder? Why do we eat maror? It's a night of Geula. So some of the Meforshim answer, because on Seder night we can recognize how the maror, the bitterness, was part of the process. Now we look back and we see that anxiety, which at the time we were so distressed by, was part of the process by which we could appreciate the Geula. So we thank God now for the maror, because at the time it was terrible. But now looking back on it, it's part of the Geula. I think this is an extremely important message for us today. Yes, sir? Yeah, perfect. Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. On the one hand, you'd ask, how could you possibly put those 2 days together? How can families who've lost so much then just morph, immediately pivot into celebration? And one answer is that, no, one day explains the other. We only really appreciate Yom HaTzmaut when we realize what we had to give for Yom HaTzmaut. Perfect example. Ever thought of it? Perfect example. So I think that's, Vasoloveitchi talks about that the Purim has those two angles, and you can't have one without the other. You need the tsar, and you need the simcha. It's not because it's sad, it's because you need that pain in order to feel the relief. Okay, let's go on to a couple of other reasons and we'll finish off. A little bit more of a pedestrian reason. I'm afraid the Sefer Eshkol over the page number 8 gives a rather sort of let down, after that beautiful idea of the tsar and the simcha, he says, oh, maybe they also instituted it so you wouldn't eat and forget to read the Megillah. Okay, so don't do that. The Levush says that, Judaism is a package deal. Rosenkis mit Mantelen, you have to have both. If you want to have the raisins, you also have to have the bitter, the almonds. You can't have it both ways. Judaism is a package deal. There's some beautiful Kabbalistic ideas. Al-Pi Kabbalah, I brought down in number 32. You can read this for yourself. It talks about the idea that we need to fast before Purim so we won't go too crazy on Purim. We come into Purim as Balei Tshuva, which will just keep the lid on how excessive Purim can get. Or, if that doesn't work, and we end up going too crazy on Purim, at least we can defend ourselves and say, yeah, okay, I went a bit crazy, but look, the day before I was very from. I was very from on Taanit Esther. So look at it as holistically. And he brings that down. He brings some other reasons as well. He talks about the idea that Gezeras Haman was not completely annulled. And in every generation, there's a new Haman and there's a new Gezerah. And he talks about Tach v'Tatz. And therefore, let's not kid ourselves, say these sources, that we can't just pretend that it's all hunky-dory. The Amalekim are still out there. And the last thing I want to just bring you is this beautiful idea, which we've hinted to and even explicitly said, of how Taanit Esther is a Yom Kniseh. It's a Yom Kehillah. Because don't forget, Haman says to Achashverosh in 33, okay, he says to the Melech, Yeshno Am Echad, Mufuzar Mufurad. The Jewish people are split, they're fighting each other, they're too busy killing each other or fighting each other to actually be unified, and that is their weakness. And then Esther says the antidote to that is Lech Knoiset Kol HaYudim. So gather together, that's the antidote, gather them together. The Midrash in Tehillim says that the point of a fast day, what is the point of a fast? The main point of a fast day is not the not eating. It's the togetherness. It's Jewish Unity Day. I think we should make this, Jewish Unity Day, because that is in all the sources. And number 36, the last source I brought you, we'll finish with this, the idea that you can't have the community without the people that you don't like. The idea that the chelbana, the foul-smelling spice, was included in the Keteras, because you don't like the people that live down the road. Well, that's your problem. They are part of the Jewish people. The idea that Sibur means Sadikim, Beinonim, Urshayim, It's a day to put those ideas aside, and of course then you can concretize that on Purim itself by not only just accepting the other people, but giving them a gift. B'shloach manos. B'shloach manos shouldn't just be your friend. Happy Purim. Happy Purim to you. It should be to someone who it really makes a difference to in an important way. So please God, we should all have a meaningful Purim. I'm sorry I wasn't able to ask her. I'll ask her afterwards, but let's leave it there for now. Purim Sameach. We should all have B'surah Tova.